Adolf Hitler's vision for a dominant German empire was one of unparalleled ambition. He sought to establish a 1,000-year Reich that would reshape the world order under Nazi rule. However, despite early military successes and the rapid expansion of Nazi Germany's territorial control, the Third Reich ultimately met a devastating defeat in 1945. The collapse of Hitler's war machine was not solely due to the strength of the Allied forces, but was largely the result of his own strategic, ideological, and tactical failures. His overconfidence, miscalculations, and inability to adapt to changing military realities played a critical role in his downfall.
One of Hitler's gravest strategic errors was the overextension of Germany's military forces. At the peak of its territorial expansion, Nazi Germany controlled vast regions across Europe, from France in the west to the Soviet Union in the east and North Africa in the south. However, Hitler's ambitions far exceeded Germany's actual military and economic capabilities. The Wehrmacht, despite its impressive early victories, was never equipped to sustain a prolonged war on multiple fronts. The best example of this overreach was Operation Barbarossa, the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly under the weight of the German blitzkrieg. However, he failed to consider the logistical challenges of waging war across such an enormous territory, especially against an enemy that had vast manpower reserves and the ability to mobilize its industries in response to the invasion. The Wehrmacht advanced rapidly in the summer and fall of 1941, but became bogged down as the Soviet winter set in. German supply lines were stretched beyond their limits, and troops suffered from inadequate preparation for the freezing temperatures. The failure to take Moscow before the winter of 1941 proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Hitler's refusal to allow strategic retreats led to enormous casualties. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, recovered quickly and mounted a massive counteroffensive, which eventually pushed the Germans back. From this point forward, Germany was engaged in a war of attrition it could not win. Hitler's underestimation of the Soviet Union was a fundamental mistake that ultimately contributed to Germany's downfall. He and his generals believed that the Red Army was poorly trained, badly led, and weakened by Stalin's purges of military officers in the 1930s. However, while the Soviets suffered heavy losses in the early stages of the war, they quickly adapted. The Soviet Union's sheer size and ability to absorb losses played a crucial role in its victory. Hitler failed to consider the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, particularly the ability to relocate key factories to the east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Stalin's leadership, combined with the determination of the Soviet people, led to a level of resistance that Hitler had not anticipated. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, was the turning point in the Eastern Front. Hitler's insistence on capturing the city, despite the enormous risks, led to one of the worst defeats in German military history. The Soviet counteroffensive encircled and destroyed the German Sixth Army, marking the beginning of a sustained push westward that would ultimately bring Soviet forces into Berlin in 1945. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, was another fatal blunder. Before this declaration, the U.S. had been providing significant aid to Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease Act, but had not actively joined the war against Germany. By formally declaring war on the U.S., Hitler ensured that Germany would face a new, immensely powerful enemy with vast industrial capacity. The American war effort quickly ramped up, and the United States became the world's leading producer of weapons, vehicles, and supplies. The American military-industrial complex, combined with its ability to transport large numbers of troops and resources across the Atlantic, overwhelmed Germany's ability to sustain the war. In addition, the U.S. Navy played a crucial role in securing the Atlantic, effectively cutting off Germany from vital resources and preventing the resupply of its forces. This decision sealed Germany's fate, ensuring that it would eventually face an insurmountable alliance of powerful enemies. After conquering France in 1940, Hitler turned his attention to Britain, believing that it could be forced into submission through aerial bombardment. However, the Battle of Britain proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. The Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, attempted to establish air superiority over Britain to pave the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion. However, the British Royal Air Force, RAF, using advanced radar technology and superior tactics, successfully repelled the Luftwaffe. Hitler's frustration led him to shift bombing strategies, targeting civilian cities instead of military installations. This gave the RAF time to recover and strengthen its defenses. The failure to defeat Britain early in the war meant that Germany had to fight a prolonged conflict while always being vulnerable to attacks from the West. Hitler's decision to divert resources to North Africa and later Italy proved to be another major mistake. While the German Africa Corps, led by Erwin Rommel, initially achieved victories, it was ultimately defeated due to logistical difficulties and the arrival of U.S. forces. The Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, in 1942, led to the collapse of German and Italian forces in the region. This paved the way for the invasion of Italy, opening up yet another front against Germany. Hitler's insistence on defending Italy at all costs drained vital resources from other battlefronts. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day, marked the beginning of the final stage of the war. Hitler mistakenly believed that the primary invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, and therefore, he delayed sending reinforcements to Normandy. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, the Allies had secured key beachheads and were pushing inland. The opening of the Western Front forced Germany into a two-front war, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west. This accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. As the war dragged on, Hitler became increasingly paranoid and isolated. He refused to listen to experienced military commanders, instead issuing irrational orders that only worsened Germany's position. He insisted on holding territory at all costs, refusing to allow strategic retreats, which resulted in massive losses. By 1945, Hitler was a broken man, issuing desperate orders from his bunker in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in. His last-ditch offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, January 1945, failed to change the course of the war. Adolf Hitler's downfall was a result of his own arrogance, strategic incompetence, and ideological fanaticism. He underestimated the strength of his enemies, overestimated the capabilities of his own military, and made reckless decisions that ultimately doomed Nazi Germany. His failures in the Soviet Union, the disastrous declaration of war on the United States, the inability to defeat Britain, and the opening of multiple fronts all contributed to the Third Reich's collapse. By May 1945, Germany was in ruins. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended in total destruction, proving that reckless ambition and ideological extremism cannot withstand the realities of war.